So I recently posted what are effectively my top 150 rankings for Dynasty just a couple weeks ago, and when you compare my rankings to Keep Trade Cut's rankings, there are most definitely differences of opinions for some players. And I know Keep Trade Cut isn't necessarily the perfect tool for player values and fair market price, but it is probably the most popular free resource out there, and I know a lot of Dynasty managers use it, if not even swear by it. So let's dive into 10 players that I consider to be the biggest buys in Dynasty based on Keep Trade Cut's rankings. Starting first with the number one buy in probably all of Dynasty fantasy football right now, Dak Prescott.
Four-man rush. Prescott escapes. Rolling, looking, throwing, caught for the touchdown. Guess who?
Right now, Dak is sitting as my Dynasty QB 16, but on Keep Trade Cut, he is currently ranked as the QB 22, which is insane to me. He is behind Tua, Goff, Bryce Young, Trevor Lawrence, Michael Penix, JJ McCarthy, all of whom I easily rank behind Dak Prescott right now. This time last year, Dak was a top 15 quarterback on Keep Trade Cut, and for whatever reason, has just lost all of this value to now barely being a Dynasty QB2. I just don't understand why he's lost all this value from just one injured season. In fact, if you remove the 2 games that Dak didn't play the whole game, he averaged 17.8 points per game over his 6 full games, which is good for QB 13 last year. He wasn't overly spectacular for fantasy, but statistically, he was still on pace for 4,700 passing yards and 28 touchdowns in those 6 full games. And that was without Brandon Cooks for some games, without any inkling of a run game, so defenses knew that Dak was going to throw 40 times a game. The situation just wasn't super ideal for a high-powered offense, yet he was still putting up big yardage games and throwing for 2+ touchdowns in 4 of those 6 full games played. And I know that everybody's hating on the Brian Schottenheimer hiring, which is understandable given the other options that they could have gone for, and Schotty isn't too inspiring either, but let's not act like this was just horrible for fantasy football. The last time Schottenheimer was calling plays was from 2018 through 2020 with the Seattle Seahawks, when he helped Russell Wilson finish as a top 10 fantasy quarterback all 3 years and a top 6 fantasy quarterback in 2 of those 3 years. Russ threw for 30 or more touchdowns all 3 seasons, threw for 4,100 or more yards twice, even hit 40 passing touchdowns in 2020, while also still being mobile with over 300 rushing yards in all 3 years and 5 total rushing touchdowns during that span. And again, this is all at ages 30 to 32 for Russell Wilson, as the last elite years that we've seen from him before having that really bad 2021 in Seattle, then getting traded to Denver, then to Pittsburgh. This was the last time we saw elite Russell Wilson was in a Brian Schottenheimer offense. So with Dak entering his age 32 season with a play caller who knows how to use a quarterback very similar to him in very recent years, with an elite wide receiver in CeeDee Lamb still, all Dak really needs is just like a good wide receiver 2 and a healthy run game to balance the offense out, sustain drives, and that should lead to more scoring opportunities for everybody involved. I mean, let's not forget that in 2023, with Brian Schottenheimer as the offensive coordinator, that Dak Prescott threw for 4,500 yards and 36 touchdowns as the QB3 in total points and QB5 in points per game. That was just 2 years ago, and effectively the same offense and personnel, just with an actual run game from not even a 100% healthy Tony Pollard for most of the year. I just don't see how Dallas doesn't address the running back position this year, especially with the crop of rookies coming out. I mean, they could realistically draft Ashton Genty at 12 overall, or get one of a multitude of guys in the 2nd or 3rd round and be immensely better than what they had with Rico Dowdle and a washed-up Zeke Elliott last year. Then they can go and sign a free agent wide receiver like Keenan Allen or Chris Godwin or Hollywood Brown, bring Amari Cooper back, and this team is drastically improved from 2024, and Dak can easily return to top 10 or even top 5 fantasy production like he was in 2021 and 2023. Do not let this Dak Prescott value just pass you by. I've had people ask me if Dak is worth a 1st-round pick in Superflex leagues, and I think that is insane. Yes, pay a 1st-round pick for Dak Prescott in Superflex. Pay a 1st and 2nd for Dak Prescott right now in Superflex leagues. Add a second round pick to Anthony Richardson. Add a second to Justin Fields if somebody believes in him. Side grade from Bryce Young and Tua and Goff and Lawrence and Penix and McCarthy. I mean, you might even get something on top of Dak to move off of some of those guys. This dynasty value makes absolutely no sense to me right now, and anyone who doesn't already roster Dak should be immediately sending out offers. Now, the other big quarterback value in my rankings compared to keep trade cut is Brock Purdy.
Purdy all day. Can't find anyone. Sets his feet, throwing end zone for Kittle. Oh, did he come down? He did! Touchdown!
Right now, I have Purdy sitting at QB 10 in my rankings, but on keep trade cut, he's valued at QB 16 behind the 5 starting rookies from last year, plus CJ Stroud still, Kyler Murray, and Jordan Love. Now, the reason that I'm higher on Purdy is because he has shown me basically 2 identical seasons of really, really good production, despite nearly completely different situations for the San Francisco 49ers. In 2023, everything was great. Christian McCaffrey was healthy all year, Debo and Ayuk were healthy and good, Kittle was good, everything worked as it was supposed to, and that led to Brock Purdy finishing with almost 4,300 passing yards, 31 passing touchdowns as a top 8 fantasy quarterback. 2024 was, of course, a different story. No Christian McCaffrey basically all year, really no Brandon Ayuk all year either, really no Debo Samuel for much of the year. Even though he was there physically, he really didn't do all that much. Even their first round pick, Ricky Pearsall, was hurt to start the year and then didn't do anything until week 17. So Purdy was throwing to really just George Kittle and Jawan Jennings, and in 15 games played, was on pace to finish the year with 4,300 yards and 23 touchdowns, which I consider to be a phenomenal season given everything that happened to San Fran this year. He still averaged 8.5 yards per attempt. His completion percentage was still sitting pretty at 66%. He averaged almost 260 passing yards per game through the same interception percentage as in 2023 too. He just didn't throw as many touchdowns. He paced for 8 fewer scores than he threw in 2023, which again, I think is actually kind of impressive considering the weapons that he didn't have in 2024 compared to 2023 and how inefficient their run game was as well. And guess what? Purdy ended the year as the QB 10 in points per game. He has now posted back-to-back top 10 finishes at the position in very different seasons, very different situations, yet he is the QB 16 in Dynasty. I understand he is not flashy. He still has the stink of being Mr. Irrelevant and how he rose to relevance in the starting job in San Francisco and still has kind of the stink of being a system quarterback as well. But assuming that he stays in San Francisco, then guys, I mean, he's in the system. It doesn't matter if he's a system quarterback if he's not leaving the system. Christian McCaffrey's going to be back this year. Ayuk will be back this year. Kittle and Jennings are still there under contract. Pearsall is entering year 2 in the NFL and ideally gets a full healthy offseason where he's not getting shot and injured. How can you not be in on Brock Purdy at these QB 16 prices? I would trade Michael Penix straight up for Brock Purdy right now. I'd even add like a late second round pick to do that. They're both basically the same age, yet Purdy has 2 top 10 seasons already under his belt to Penix's just 5 games started. I'd trade Stroud for Purdy plus, Love for Purdy plus, Kyler for Purdy plus, and if you get a good enough piece to trade off of one of the rookies in Drake May, Caleb Williams, or Bo Nix for Brock Purdy plus, I might even consider doing that too. And of course, I want to trade up from Trevor Lawrence, from Bryce Young, Tua, McCarthy, up to Brock Purdy because his floor and ceiling is probably higher than all of those guys. McCarthy really being the one that we just don't know yet, but I think they're both pretty similar players, kind of benefiting from their system and their offense and their weapons. So give me the known production of Brock Purdy right now over the unknown of JJ McCarthy. If you're looking for the perfect Superflex QB2 right now, that answer to me is first Dak Prescott. But then number 2 is Brock Purdy. Then the final quarterback that apparently I think is a value when comparing my rankings to keep trade cut is actually Anthony Richardson.
Richardson slips. Now he's airing it out deep down the field for Pierce. Touchdown!
Now Richardson is the QB 23 on keep trade cut, 1 spot behind Dak Prescott, but I have him at QB 18 for really no other reason than just absolute pure upside. I don't even consider myself an Anthony Richardson fan, but if you can get him at QB 23 prices, I am all for it as your QB 3 for bye weeks and injuries, but with the room to grow into that quarterback that many people still want him to be. And I do believe that upside is still there because after returning in week 11 from injury QB3 last year, Richardson averaged 20 points per game as the QB10 over that final stretch of the season, including 3 games over 21 points and only 1 game under 15. And it's really all just because of the rushing numbers. He averaged 50 yards per game, 1 rushing touchdown per game during that stretch, which is a 17-game pace of 900 rushing yards and 17 touchdowns. I mean, that's really all Richardson is and has been in the NFL. But if he's going to keep his job as a starter and be doing this on the ground, that's worth it in and of itself on an upside shot at essentially QB3 prices. And then, of course, there's all the what ifs still surrounding Anthony Richardson. Reports are right now that he's working with mechanics coach Chris Hess, who's basically fully credited for fixing Josh Allen before his huge year 3 breakout. So what if this mechanics coach also fixes Anthony Richardson, and now we get legitimate passing production to go along with the rushing, kind of like Josh Allen. There's also the what if the Colts add more weapons for Richardson to throw to. Michael Pittman and Josh Downs are fine, but neither are really truly alpha wide receivers at the NFL level. Plus, Richardson has had 0 help from a friendly check down tight end. So imagine if the Colts leave the NFL draft with, say, Tyler Warren and Jalen Royals, or Trey Harris and Elijah Arroyo. Whatever the combination may be after the draft, the Colts could pull something like that to further help Richardson. Again, kind of like the Bills did with Josh Allen, or even the Eagles did with Jalen Hurts under Shane Steichen. But really, the third and final what if is kind of the most important. What if he can just stay healthy? Obviously, none of his mechanic work or weapons added mean anything if Anthony Richardson continues to get hurt. So if he can stay healthy and just gain more experience and reps in the NFL, that would be tremendous for his potential upside too. So like I said, I am only looking at Richardson if you can get him for QB3 prices. I'm talking upgrading from Fields to Richardson with a 2nd round pick. Darnold in a second for Richardson. Or if you have a really old guy as your QB3, you want some youth, you want some upside, Stafford in a second, Cousins in a second, Carr in a second, whatever it is that's a very low cost move to acquire the lottery ticket that is Anthony Richardson, I'm in on that right now. Now, moving on to running backs, it is kind of hard to advise buying cheap running backs right now because so much can still happen that can just bomb projected starters' values in free agency or really the NFL draft this year with how many good rookies there are. But I feel confident in both of these guys as 2025 starters going cheaper than where I would value them. The first being the easiest one to argue for in Alvin Kamara.
Alvin Kamara, room to roll. Alvin Kamara's going to score. Touchdown.
I said the argument for Kamara is simple because it really is. He's old, but he's still just so productive. Since 2021, Kamara has finished as the RB6, RB14, RB3, and RB5. So at worst, he's been a top 15 guy, and at best, he's been a top 6 guy in 3 out of the last 4 years. That is insane. That kind of consistency and predictability is so hard to find at the running back position, especially when it's as elite of production as he's been giving us. Yet he's also constantly undervalued every single year in both Dynasty and Redraft, probably due to age, maybe a little bit of boredom too at this point, just because how long can he keep playing like this that he just can't keep being so good, yet here he is being elite every single year. Right now on Keep Trade Cut, he's the RB22 behind David Montgomery, Joe Mixon, Tyrone Tracy, Brian Robinson, Isaiah Pacheco, and even Zach Charbonnet for whatever reason. He's only 2 spots ahead of Trey Benson, 3 ahead of Travis Etienne, 4 spots ahead of J.K. Dobbins. And especially when you compare his RB22 value to Derrick Henry's value at RB13, who only averaged 0.8 more points per game than Alvin Kamara this year, and is also practically 2 years older, you really start to understand just how insane Kamara being at RB22 really is. This is honestly one of the easiest ways that you, as a contender, can add extra value to your roster, while also not losing any production at all, perhaps even gaining production on your roster. If you have Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, even guys like Kenneth Walker, Jonathan Taylor, Chase Brown, Chuba Hubbard, if you can trade those guys for Alvin Kamara plus, I mean, I just find that kind of insane. I don't really care about age at the running back position. I just want points and production if I am contending, especially if you can get something of value on top of Kamara by moving down from one of those running backs, whether that's an extra second or a young upside player like a Cedric Tillman or a Jalen Coker, Rashad Bateman, maybe even Tank Dell right now with his injury and really not looking to play in 2025. Or you add another older guy that will also help you produce in 2025. Guys like Cortland Sutton, Chris Godwin, Devontae Adams right now, who's wide receiver 48 on Keep Trade Cut. And I bet some of you can do even crazier things out there. Like if someone in your league loves Chase Brown or Jonathan Taylor or James Cook, and you get Alvin Kamara plus a 2026 or 2027 first round pick, I mean, that first is just gravy on top of a player who already outproduced every single one of those guys in 2024 with no reason whatsoever for that to change in 2025 because the offense and the situation are all the same. No one on that team is stealing touches from Alvin Kamara, and they don't have the money and limited draft capital to add someone of significant danger to steal touches in 2025. So please buy Alvin Kamara now before his value increases the closer we get to the season. Now, the other running back that I love buying at his Keep Trade Cut value right now is Ramondre Stevenson.
Stevenson looking for a block. He got it from Myers, and there he goes. Kiss him goodbye. That is a touchdown.
On Keep Trade Cut, Stevenson is valued as the RB33, as essentially the last current starter in the NFL right now, and behind a handful of backups even like Zach Charbonnet, Trey Benson, Tyjae Spears, Jonathan Brooks, Tank Bigsby, and he's only 1 to 3 spots ahead of Braylon Allen, Jalen Wright, and Blake Corum. And I understand why. His 2024 season was pretty uninspiring as the Patriots offense just in general was just really, really bad even after Drake May took over. But there were still a lot of positives for Ramondre that if the offense were to improve in 2025, things will get a lot better for Stevenson for fantasy football. First of all, Ramondre was a workhorse in 2024. From weeks 1 through 16, he averaged 14.5 carries per game and 2.5 receptions per game, totaling 16 touches per game or 290 touches over a full 17-game season. He was on pace for nearly 1,000 rushing yards, another 200 receiving yards, 9 to 10 total touchdowns. He also averaged 12.7 PPR points per game, which would have been good for RB21 on the year, ahead of DeAndre Swift, Tony Pollard, Rico Dowdle, and Najee Harris. And this was all in what was essentially the worst offense in the entire NFL in 2024. New England was last in the NFL in total passing yards, the only team under 3,000 yards as a team in 2024. They were 31st in passing touchdowns. They were 25th in rushing touchdowns, 31st in total yards, 29th in yards per play, and 28th in percentage of drives ending in a score. The one single positive thing for New England as a team was rushing. They were 13th in rushing yards and yards per carry as a team, partially due to Drake May's mobility, but also largely due to Ramondre Stevenson as well. So the hope is that the Patriots look at their team as a whole and address all of the other major holes in their offense and don't really look at running back because they don't really need to. They signed Ramondre to an extension last year. Gibson still has 2 years left of a 3-year deal that he signed last year, so they don't need to add anyone at the running back position. They pick 4th overall in the draft, so they aren't drafting a running back there. And then 5 of their other 8 draft picks this year are in the 4th round or later, which doesn't really scare me at all for Ramondre if they draft someone on day 3. And that's not even to mention all the other needs that they have on the team, like offensive line, including both tackle spots, wide receiver for sure, edge rusher, D-line, safety, cornerback, you name it, New England probably needs it. So running back should be near the bottom of the list given their monetary investment into the position last year and massive needs everywhere else. So if we assume that Ramondre is still the RB1 this year, the last piece of this is really the coaching hires for New England were absolutely perfect for Ramondre's fantasy value. We all know that Mike Vrabel wants to run the ball, and while Ramondre is certainly no Derrick Henry, he can still get the job done between the tackles and in the receiving game too, to be a 300-plus touch workhorse for the team. New England also brought back Josh McDaniels as their offensive coordinator, who in 2020 and 2021, without Tom Brady, had a double-digit touchdown rusher. In 2020, it was Cam Newton with 12 rushing touchdowns, 10 of which came inside the 5, and in 2021, it was Damian Harris with 15 rushing touchdowns, where again, 10 of them came from inside the 5. And not to mention that Josh Jacobs had 12 rushing touchdowns on 340 carries under Josh McDaniels in 2022 with the Vegas Raiders with Derek Carr at quarterback. So if we can hope that the Patriots offense is better this year, which really seems only likely given how bad they were in 2024, the offense improves, which leads to sustained drives, hopefully more scoring opportunities. Plus, we have coaching hires of a run-first head coach and a high rushing touchdown volume offensive coordinator. Then plus an insanely cheap price point of RB33 on Keep Trade Cut. All of this equals a running back that I want to take a shot on as my RB3 or even RB4 that could turn into a weekly RB2 starter for me in season. As a contender, I'd be willing to pay my late 2025 second or hopefully late 2026 second, and you may not even need to pay that much for Ramondre. 2/3 might even get it done, or somebody like Kendre Miller and a 3rd round pick, Rachaad White and a 3rd round pick. Maybe you have extra wide receiver depth that you'll never use, and you can send somebody like Ricky Pearsall or Quentin Johnston or Xavier Legette for Ramondre Stevenson. Add a 3rd round pick to them even just to get the deal done. Who cares? I definitely want to buy Ramondre now before free agency, before the NFL draft, because if he survives both, which I think is a pretty good chance that he does, his value will probably spike in the summer as a confirmed 2025 starter, especially if he starts getting hype as a sleeper from other channels in Dynasty or in redraft that could drive his value up in a few months. So buy now on the super cheap while you still can. Now, before we get to the wide receiver position, I want to quickly touch on just 2 cheap tight ends that you could buy. The first being Ramondre's teammate, actually, in Hunter Henry.
Shovel pass here to Henry. Henry up the gut.
Now, the argument for Henry is pretty similar to Ramondre's in that I don't think Henry is going to get replaced as the starting tight end for New England, and his role and production under Josh Daniels before was the best that he's had for fantasy football, with 600 yards and 9 touchdowns in 2021 as the last year that McDaniels was calling plays for New England. And I know that Henry is going to lose target opportunities as this team adds more wide receivers. That's an absolute guarantee for sure, but Henry is also not really a PPR guy for fantasy. His value is much more related to his touchdown production. In that 2021 season, Henry only caught 50 passes for those 600 yards and those 9 touchdowns, all of which came inside the red zone, 5 of which came inside the 10, that I could see him being a red zone target once again for Drake May in 2025. And Henry did that in 2021 with Jacoby Myers seeing 125 targets and Kendrick Bourne and Nelson Aguilar combining for 135. So even if New England goes out and they sign T. Higgins in free agency and he gets like 130 targets, then Demario Douglas gets his 80, Kayshon Boutte gets his 60, that is essentially the same breakdown as in 2021 when Henry also got 75 targets. Not to mention that Austin Hooper's 60 targets from last year are probably gone in free agency, opening things up even more for Hunter Henry. He's a Dynasty tight end 29 on Keep Trade Cut, which is fine considering all of the names above him, but if you're able to grab him right now as like a throw-in in your next deal as your tight end 2 or your streamable option tight end 1, I don't really hate it right now. The other tight end right behind Henry in value is impending free agent Mike Gesicki.
Wide open. Gesicki running free. Loping to the end zone.
Now, as we all know, Gesicki revitalized his career this year with the Bengals as the really strong third option behind Jamar Chase and T. Higgins that they lost from Tyler Boyd leaving. And Gesicki also had some big games when Higgins was out as the second target on the team. At this moment, I actually expect Gesicki to re-sign in Cincinnati. He said himself that he wants to stay there, and especially with the news that Eric All will miss all of 2025 again, Cincinnati also kind of needs him. There is also the upside that maybe T. Higgins doesn't re-sign and Mike Gesicki does, meaning that Gesicki could find himself as a second option on the team more often than not in 2025, depending on who they add at wide receiver to replace Higgins, or if it's just Andre Yoshivas or Jermaine Burton fighting for that spot. So there is that upside there too for Mike Gesicki. There is also the downside of Cincy being linked to a rookie tight end in the draft, most notably either Colston Loveland or Tyler Warren in the first round. If that happens, then yeah, Gesicki probably wouldn't be that great as the tight end 2 in Cincy, but again, at tight end 31 prices on Keep Trade Cut, he's just a throw-in in a deal that could pay off if the offseason is very kind to him. All right, on to wide receivers, and we're going to start with a player that I actually have the biggest difference in value compared to Keep Trade Cut. Seahawks wide receiver DK Metcalf.
Wide open. Metcalf. Touchdown. 56 yards.
Listen, I understand why Metcalf has lost value. He didn't hit 1,000 yards last year. He only caught 5 touchdowns. He's no longer the wide receiver 1 on the team because that is now JSN. I personally have given up on Metcalf ever being the elite wide receiver that he thought he could be after his breakout 2020 season, but wide receiver 27 on Keep Trade Cut, that is way too low for me. I still have him personally as a top 20 Dynasty wide receiver because he's still been very consistent on a yearly basis, and he has that weekly upside to be a fantasy wide receiver 1 any given week. Since 2021, Metcalf has finished as the points per game wide receiver 23, wide receiver 25, wide receiver 22, and then wide receiver 34 this past season. So just from that, I think I can see which season is more of the outlier year for production, and that valuing him at wide receiver 27 is actually under his production in 3 of the last 4 years. In 2024, his down year even, Metcalf was on a 17-game pace of 75 receptions, over 1,100 yards, 6 receiving touchdowns. And if you watch Seattle at all during the season, you know that he probably should have been closer to 10 touchdowns or more with how often Geno missed him, or defenders would just blatantly pass interfere with him because he's so much bigger than any cornerback against him. But where I'm most optimistic for Metcalf this year, though, is with the Seahawks hiring of Klint Kubiak as their offensive coordinator. Kubiak, of course, coming from the New Orleans Saints this past year, who looked fantastic to start the year until basically everybody on that team got hurt. But Rashid Shaheed was doing well in that more vertical pass attack with Derek Carr that I also think fits well with DK Metcalf's strengths. But Kubiak was also the offensive coordinator with Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota in 2021, so we saw Justin Jefferson operate at an elite level. He was also the passing game coordinator in San Francisco in 2023 with Kyle Shanahan during Brock Purdy's breakout year, with Brandon Ayuk having the best season of his career. So I'm hopeful that Kubiak will come in and elevate the passing offense to where both Metcalf and JSN can operate as great fantasy options simultaneously. And with Metcalf's big playability, plus his red zone work as a big target for Geno Smith, I'm hopeful that we can get Metcalf to be more consistent on a weekly basis and also still have those huge games. Worst case scenario, I think Metcalf is just a fine wide receiver 2, like he's been in 3 of the last 4 years. And that is fine if you're paying wide receiver 27 prices for him. But best case scenario is a top 15 fantasy season as a more later career resurgence, kind of like what we saw from Chris Godwin and Terry McLaurin this year, or even T. Higgins. I would love to move up from Jaden Reed, Jerry Jeudy, Josh Downs, or Khalil Shakir to DK Metcalf by using a second round pick or a piece like that to upgrade to DK. I'd also explore trading down from Xavier Worthy, Jameson Williams, and Jordan Addison for DK Metcalf Plus. And apparently on Keep Trade Cut, people prefer Chris Olave over DK Metcalf too, so I'd love to flip Olave over to DK, possibly get something on top of that as well. Now, the other wide receiver that's valued right behind Metcalf at wide receiver 28 that I love buying right now is DJ Moore.
2nd and 6, back to Moore, blockers in front, DJ Moore weaving up the sideline, Moore inside the 10, steps through contact, he's in for a Chicago touchdown.
And it's actually a very similar argument as DK Metcalf. Moore lost value this year because of a down year with a rookie quarterback in a really bad offensive system, with hopefully both of those problems being addressed in 2025 with the hiring of Ben Johnson. We saw what happened to Jackson Smith-Njigba once he was removed from a Shane Waldron offense and the misutilization in that system. And I think the same thing will happen with DJ Moore, who was also just completely misutilized with Shane Waldron in 2024. I mean, we saw it happen to DJ Moore already over the second half of last year. Literally as soon as Shane Waldron was fired in week 10, Moore's 17-game pace from week 11 on was 123 receptions, 1,200 yards, 6 receiving touchdowns. He averaged over 17 PPR points per game as the wide receiver 16, which was actually better than Jackson Smith-Njigba over the second half of the year, and right there with CeeDee Lamb and Drake London. So now in 2025, the hope is that a lot of the offensive struggles that plagued Chicago can start to be addressed. Better play calling, focusing on offensive line improvements, a year 2 Caleb Williams with a better coaching staff around him, no Keenan Allen, so the target share is condensed more between DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, and if DJ Moore can even slide into that Amon-Ra St. Brown role as a PPR plus yak guy in Chicago, I mean, that would just be icing on the cake. Like, I'm already expecting DJ Moore to easily outperform his wide receiver 28 KTC value, even if Chicago doesn't drastically improve overnight. I mean, he was already doing so last year to end the season already, but there's also that upside of what if Chicago really improves, and what if DJ Moore sees 150 or 160 targets in 2025, scores 7+ touchdowns again like he did in 2023. Like, that upside is tantalizing at wide receiver 28 prices. I'm looking at these same players to upgrade from as I did with Metcalf, Reed, Jeudy, Downs, Shakir, Ayuk even. I'd take DJ Moore over DK Metcalf right now too. And again, the same players to downgrade from and get something on top. Worthy, Jameson, Addison, Olave, even Terry McLaurin could be an option as well. DJ Moore feels like such a low-cost bet if you want to get in on the Bears offense improving this year, especially compared to Rome Odunze, and I love every single minute of it. And the last wide receiver that I love buying right now is Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown.
Backfield, he's got Brown. A.J. Brown cuts it back. Looking for the end zone. Inside the 15. Inside the 10. He's in.
I mean, statistically speaking, this was A.J. Brown's worst season as an Eagle. He only had 67 receptions, just under 1,100 yards, and 7 touchdowns. But he also missed 4 games as the first time that he's ever been hurt enough to miss games in Philadelphia. So his 17-game pace was actually 88 receptions for over 1,400 yards and 9 touchdowns, which would have been his 3rd consecutive 1,400-yard season since joining the Philadelphia Eagles. That is insane. He had 5 100-yard games in 13 games played, 3 more games over 80 yards. He scored in more games than not and only had 2 games below double-digit PPR fantasy points. And he was doing all of this while the Eagles threw less than they ever had since A.J. Brown joined the team because Saquon was taking runs to the house constantly and rushed for over 2,000 yards. They didn't have to throw this year because Saquon was just that good. But when they did throw the ball, and in the games that A.J. Brown played, he commanded a 34% target share, which was second highest in the league behind only Malik Neighbors and one of only 4 wide receivers to get over that 30% mark this year. So just imagine what could happen in 2025 when Philly probably needs to throw more, because I seriously doubt that Saquon is going to rush for 2,000 yards again next year, or that he and Jalen Hurts will combine for 27 rushing touchdowns again. If their offense sways even slightly back to needing to throw more, then A.J. Brown is going to be a huge winner with top 3 fantasy upside, as he's already shown with his 2022 and 2023 seasons in Philadelphia. I have A.J. Brown as my Dynasty wide receiver 9, firmly ahead of JSN, Ladd McConkey, Drake London, Garrett Wilson, and Marvin Harrison Jr. Those guys are great. They should all have great careers. They're all definitely a few years younger than A.J. Brown, but A.J. Brown is elite right now. If you're a contending team and you wonder why you can't even get out of 3rd, 4th, or those 5th place finishes, it's probably because you don't have enough hammers at the wide receiver position. And guess what? A.J. Brown, absolutely a hammer. And at only 27 years old, you still have 3 more years before he's 30, in which case he might have 3 more 1,400-yard and 9+ touchdown seasons, while all those other younger guys are struggling just to get to 12 and 1,300 yards and like 6 or 7 touchdowns. So take advantage of this depressed value. Now is the time to upgrade your wide receiver 2 from Rome Odunze or Devonta Smith or Zay Flowers and go get A.J. Brown. Package 2 wide receivers together like Chris Olave and Xavier Worthy to consolidate your roster, but gaining a massive weekly edge with a top 5 fantasy receiver. Or, like I said, remove the unknownness still of Marvin Harrison or Drake London or Garrett Wilson and the hope that they might break out soon or continue their breakout production, and just go get a guy who's been doing it and will continue to do it in A.J. Brown. And if you guys were interested in how I build out my Dynasty rosters, which includes having a couple of those hammer wide receivers that I talked about with A.J. Brown, then I highly recommend that you guys check out this video right up here.